Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mini-Doc, a hobby channel focused on miniatures, lore, and yore from now to the past. Join me and my occasional companions as we explore the wild, detailed world, war, and everything else in between, their lore, and various other tadbits. So, today we're going to be talking about the complexity and availability of a game everyone calls Warhammer, but I call it Math Hammer because it's just rolling dice and it's kind of complex sometimes. It's a game that is really easy to get into, but is extremely difficult to play without extended studying. So to help us, or new people in general, I made a tier list for about the 20 to 30ish armies in this game. For starters, up first is Lobotomite. You cannot fail to play this army. You show up to the table, you roll a certain amount of dice, and you use a ruler. It's really hard to mess up this one. Pick up play is exactly what it sounds like. An army you can pick up and grab at last minute with a little bit of reading, not too much, like their names and stat line, and then you play the game. Basic brain required. This requires a bit more reading than pick up playing. You need to know their faction rules and everything in between. Contrived or counterintuitive. This tier is for armies that are kind of complicated to learn, or in the way of, if you're starting out to play the game, they teach you a play style that will hurt you greatly. Complex brain is these armies require a lot of a certain resource, albeit money, time, organization, and a lot of reading in between. If you lack the time or the ability to do at least one of these things, avoid until later. And finally, we have a literal supercomputer. All those resources I listed, this tier is all about those armies that require all those resources. These armies are not beginner-friendly, a pain to get up and ready, and or just very time-consuming just to paint and get on the table. So, with that out of the way, let's start with Eldari, Space Elves. There's 3 flavors. You got Space Clowns, you have Dark Elves, and then you have Normal Elves, but like space. So, the first one on the Eldari list is Craft Worlds. Craft Worlds offer a large range of models, but their biggest thing is their psychic abilities. Psychic abilities used to be a lot complex back then, back in 9th and 8th edition, but in 10th edition, they're a lot simpler. This works in their favor now because they can go into the simple brain required. This is good because they need that. Back then, they were too complex for a new player to pick up. Now they're a lot more friendlier. You can run an army of Wraith units, Ghost Knight warriors with a large, gigantic physique, and will tear through anything. You can run an entire detachment of Psychic Elves, and Psychic Space Elves to be exact, and with buffs on your side, it's really hard to detach them. Their faction rule is Strands of Fate, where they get to change the dice roll of something. So, for instance, if I have a dice that I rolled at the start of the game was a 6, let's say later in the game, I need a 6, I can change that dice with a 6 out with that other dice. It really allows you to play, it kind of teaches you a banking system of playing the game. So, that definitely goes into basic brain required. Next up is Drukhari, the sadistic, pain-hungry Dark Elves. They have a bit of a wider range. They're filled with abominations, man-made abominations. We love those. They're made of Dark Elves that are fast, and that's their whole army. They're all about speed, uncontrolled temper, and a whole lot of movement. A lot of boats. If you're a pirate person, there's a lot of boats. And they have 3 different casts to them in a way. They have the Witch Cults, which are more melee/beast focus. Then they have the Cabals, which are a lot more generic. And then finally, you have the Homunculus. And the Homunculus are essentially creating said man-made horrors. But in this case, it'd be elves. Elf-made horrors. However, the Drukhari in this edition has not been treated nicely, and they go into the bit of the complex. They are a pain to paint, and they're very expensive. The only way to play Drukhari is to have a disposable income. So, Eldari is out of the way now. On to Chaos. Chaos is unruly, untempered chaos and destruction. First up is Chaos Demons, the literal manifestation of emotions and emotions times 10, basically. And they all have a god. So, for starters, you have Nurgle. Nurgle's all about deadly resilience, heavy resilience, but very slow in spreading poison and plagues. Khorne is all about melee potential, running up the board, and smashing your opponents. Slaanesh is all about trickery, improving your units, and going fast. And then you have Tzeentch, which is generally confuse everyone on the board, including yourself. Tzeentch has a lot of play styles because he doesn't actually have a play style. That confused me in my script somehow. All these 4 Chaos Guides, they're going into... All 4 Chaos Gods are going to pick up play tier. They're not that hard. It only gets hard if you start throwing in giant units like Be'lakor, which is the size of a human toddler practically, or just a lot of units at once at your face. So pick up play tier is every army goes towards, especially Khorne. Khorne is really easy to learn. Next up is Chaos Knights. Chaos Knights are giant hulking abominants of technology with large guns and melee weapons that absolutely curb stomp your opponents. The biggest appeal of Chaos Knights is they're both lobotomite and counterintuitive tiers of easy to play. The fact is, you pick up a model, you buy a model, and you're done. That's almost all of your points gone. Mind you, we're talking about 500 points. A knight is around that 300, 400 range. If you upgrade it, you can make it around that. Like, you could kind of, if you curb it a bit, you can make it in that 500 range. So you pick up a model, you're good to go. You can play the game. The problem is with knights is that they're counterintuitive because they kill everything in sight. If you're playing a 500-point game, mind you, a 500-point game is a really small game for Warhammer. Everyone's just not going to have fun. There's not going to be anti-vehicle capabilities. And they're very, very unpredictable at times. So that's how they are. And I'm going to throw knights in here too. Knights are also counterintuitive and lobotomite at the same time because they're so easy to learn. There's no actual skill to them. There's no learning curve. Next up is Chaos Space Marines. These guys are Space Marines, but with spikes. They use demons, possession, mutations, demonic gifts, which are just more mutations. They're essentially your quote-unquote bad guy option. Chaos Marines have options to taking Chaos Knights, Chaos Demons. They can take a lot of other allied units with the Chaos word, which gives them a lot of flexibility. Chaos Demons mainly rely on demon engines, and they rely on sorcery. Their faction ability is Dark Pax. Dark Pax allows them to trade their health for extra damage. This is huge because a simple unit of cultists can turn into an absolute death squad if you're not ready to deal with it. But since they're Space Marines, they're going into basic tier. They're going into basic brain required because you got to do some reading on their Dark Pax. But besides that, you're pretty much good to go. And they have a lot of flavor, a lot of named characters like Abaddon the Despoiler, Harkin World Claimer, a lot of cool metal names. Next up is Death Guard. Death Guard is slow-moving servants of Nurgles. They're Chaos Marines, but they're really slow. And since they're Chaos Marines, they're going in the same tier as them. They're going to basic to play. They have a unique rule. Instead of Dark Pax, they have a aura, basically, and they debuff your enemies. And over time, that aura gets bigger, and it does a lot more things. So be careful about that. Thousand Suns are next. Remember Tzeentch? Yeah, he controls these guys practically. Remember when I said Tzeentch didn't have a playstyle? Neither does these guys. They remain pretty heavy on psychic. Almost they focus on buffing their psychic. They focus on buffing just psychic in general. Buffing their frontline units like the Rubric Marines, which are slow, undead mummies in basically a truck's worth of armor. They use a system called Cabal points. I don't know how that works, but from my knowledge, I don't know how that works in advanced terms, but how I know is depending how big the game is, you get more Cabal points. These guys are going into complex because they require a lot of effort. to paint, to understand. They're not your first pick. In some ways, you could even say they're super complex AI levels of playing because they have so much stuff that you need. Next up is World Eaters, the newest faction, and they're going ahead in Lobotomite. World Eaters are melee focused, they hit hard, and they have a ton of buffs. Their centerpiece unit, Angron, is humongous, but he can revive, and one might say, well, that's counterintuitive. They're not counterintuitive because they still have shooting, and they still have a bunch of other options. It's just, they're really hard to play because they don't have a lot of units. They probably have 9 data sheets. That means they have 9 units they can take without, that's like 9 units. That's not a lot. Compared to others that have like into the hundreds, yeah, no, there's no way. Next up is Adeptus Sororitas, nuns with guns. Surprisingly, really good. Kind of. They rely on a system called Miracle and Acts of Faith, which essentially allows you to change a dice roll to your favor. This is huge because being able to change your dice on the fly, just like Eldar, are really good. But sadly, some of your units have to die to get that. That's not really worth it, in my opinion. Plus, they're really expensive. There's these boxes called combat patrols, and they're really inexpensive. But if you want to expend your army, be prepared to spend upwards to $300. Yeah, that's not exactly a value. So they go into complex. They have too many rules for a new player to pick up and learn unless you absolutely simplify it. You need the combat patrol. You need this and that. And it goes just down this road. And in a 500-point game, the Adeptus Sororitas does it right. So complex they go. There's a ton of Space Marines, but I'm not going to go over them. I'm going to go over Space Marines as a whole. Space Marines automatically go into basic brain required, but also pickup play tier. That's because they are extremely simple. They are the baseline. They are the standard. If anyone says, "Oh, I'm not good as like Space Marines," it's not because they're complaining. Well, they are. It's just Space Marines are the standard. If you go below the standard, you're not doing good. They're super easy to paint too. They're rather inexpensive. They always have tons of deals, and once more, they're really inexpensive. You can find entire boxes of dozens of them that if you bought them separately, they would be hundreds of dollars. But nope, it's like $160 for a box of like 20 or 30. That's really good in GW terms. Next up is the Adeptus Custodes. They're elite. They're very elite. There's very few of them, so you have to buy not a lot of them, and they hit hard. They hit probably as hard as a semi-truck. The difference here, though, is that the Adeptus Custodes, while they are strong, somewhat easy to paint, and really inexpensive, they have to go into counterintuitive. They're a bit too strong. If you pick them up as a new player, you're not going to have the hardships of the game. Custodes are that army where you want to reward yourself. Okay, I've had a lot of hard games. Let me cook. Let me win type of thing. And next up, the first super complex levels of playing is the Adeptus Mechanicus. Holy crap. These guys have arguably some of the best shooting in the entire game, but they have so many rules, so many buffs, and they're not really something you should be gravitating towards. Yeah, they look cool, but they're not playing cool right now. They don't have a lot of good rules until their big book comes out, which is called a Codex, which has all their updated rules, detachments, which are like smaller factions within the faction that give you buffs. But it's also because they're extremely hard to paint, they're expensive. It's just not something you should pick up as a new player. Yes, there are advantages because you can learn all those hardships, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get curb stomped. If you don't know how to use those buffs, you're kind of done for. While, yes, they do have a lot of other things, like, for instance, they look very cool. The Adeptus Mechanicus use a lot of experimental and dangerous technology. While it is cool, it doesn't really help them out that much. Next up is Agents in the Imperium. This is less of an army, and it's more of like I have a couple 100 points remaining. Let me take these guys. As the name suggests, you only can take them with the Imperium, so the Imperium forces, so humankind, basically. But the biggest upside of them is that some of them are really good. You can take a whole class of assassins, They have a range from anti-tank, anti-horde, anti-this, anti-that, that the Ancients of the Imperium are practically your answer to everything. Okay, I'm playing Space Marines, but my army is focused towards anti-tank. Well, I can take something that deals with anti-infantry, and it just goes down to there. So they kind of jump all the way over the range. They're lobotomite levels of easy to play, but some of them have like really good techniques, but they're really expensive, and they go all the way bottom to complex. So next up is Astra Militarum. Without a doubt, a literal it goes beyond the ties of super complex AI and complex brain levels of playing, because they have so many rules. They have so many models to paint, and they're not cheap. Their tanks, some of their newest tanks, are up to hundreds of dollars. There's nothing you can do about that. But they are quite cool, but they're not cool enough to help them. They suffer from the fact that they cost too much. In game, they're all a horde army, cheap infantry units backed by really crappy tanks that have somewhat good shooting, and those tanks are usually backed up by even better tanks. So you're playing the 1940s Russians basically, and you're not given any other alternative. But once more, they go into the kind of border on super complex AI, but also complex brain. It kind of up to you. Paint about 20, and get back to me on that. And let's see how much you're loving the Astra Militarum. The guard broke before the planet did. Yeah. Grey Knights. They're anti-demons Space Marines. They have a lot of anti-demon weapons. They're very good against demons. Anything that is a demon will cry in a corner. They teleport. Their whole thing is teleporting. You will have no board control. You are going to suffer. They will teleport in your back line. They will teleport everywhere, on objectives, on their side, on your side. If you're not careful, Grey Knights can take your board state. And they're not that complicated. It's just right now in 10th edition, they kind of are bad. I say kind of, but it's more like they suck. They don't have... A case could be made for the Adeptus Sororitas, but it can't be said for Grey Knights. They don't have a good enough detachment rule to really be effective. So they have to go somewhere amongst complex, but also counterintuitive, because you're not learning the game properly, because you're not on edge of everyone else. You're not on that standard level. You're not the standard. You may be a Space Marine, but you're not a Space Marine. Next up, we have Gene Stealer cults. Gene Stealer cults are effectively, think about it as like a planetary militia, Revolutionary War-esque thing. Mix it with some like man-made horrors. They're much of a horde army. They're more into shooting, but they have like weird creatures, the abominations, aberrants, anything monstrous they can throw at you. They rely pretty heavily on buffs. They rely heavy on painting, and if you don't paint them right, they're going to look silly. I tried painting sometimes, and they looked like they were jellyfish. However, besides that small gripe, they also have to go into complex brain. Nope. Psych. Like I said, painting goes in this as well. They have to go into super complex. They rely on buffs that cost a lot of money. If you buy the combat patrol, But regardless, the Gene Stealer cults are really fun to play right now because of their rule, which allows them to resurrect dead enemy units. Well, dead Gene Stealer units. So it allows them to really not really die. If you can't control them, they're going to come back on the board, and they're going to take it back from you. Leagues of Votann, they're Space Marines. But dwarves, they're 5'11" Space Marines versus 6-foot Space Marines. Their biggest thing is their models there's not a lot of them. There's like 19 data sheets. I think they have less than World Eater. There's not a lot of them. It's just not very good right now. Leagues of Votann used to be very good, but now they're not. They're on the same tier as Space Marines. They rely heavily on ranged weaponry, and because of that, they have a lot of experimental weapons too. Their tanks are very good, and it heavily relies on you being able to place your units right, and their mechanic is called grudge tokens. Grudge tokens are essentially Grudge tokens are the embodiment of, hey, you killed my guy. I'm going to kill you even harder. There's not a lot of Leagues of Votann players, though, and there's not a lot of Leagues of Votann tournament winners either. There's not a lot of good graphical data, to say the least, to be like, okay, yeah, pick this army. You're going to love it. That being said, they kind of have to go into complex brain. You have to know what you're doing. You have to paint them right. But they're more on the expensive side, unless you pick up the combat patrol box. Honestly, if I said combat patrol box for each of these, they would all be pick up and play, but they're not. So Necrons are next. They're unkillable, reviving slow metal skeleton warriors with a real love for turning their gods into Pokemon. They're very much Terminators in space. And out of the way, out of the box, they're pretty much pick up and play and lobotomite levels of easy. You roll a die. When they die, you roll a dice. If you get a high enough number, they're resurrected. There you go. That's all you need to know. There are a lot of Necron players, and I've talked to a lot of Necron players, who don't even know some of their rules because they don't need to know them. Okay, why do I need to learn this 2-page stratagem? Mind you, stratagems are like extra abilities that can help you out, but they cost command points, and command points are very limited. Necrons don't know that. They don't care about that because I can just resurrect each time. And they're very strong. They're strong in the fact that you get a lot of them. A lot of them. You are not suffering from the same issues Custodies are. For each Custody on the board, there's probably about 10 to 20 Necron warriors. So, yeah, Necrons are definitely very easy to play. Next up are Orcs. Orcs, they go all over the spectrum. Orcs are a horde army that has a couple of flavors to them. You have the workshop side, which relies heavily on vehicles. They rely very heavily on, like, cop does, death spinners, all this stuff. Because they're orcs. They're silly. They're goofy. Nothing makes sense because they're silly. That's how it is. They warp literal reality. The other side to them is the beast snaggas, which are more primitive, more melee-focused, less vehicles, more infantry. They're really good in melee. And then the last one, you have a middle of the road, the generic trail. They have a lot of good models, and this is where we kind of get in the reason why they're all over the place. They're an army you're meant to kit bash. Armies are I've seen entire armies made out of cheap dollar store-esque miniatures. Like, they're not an army that's too difficult to get your hands on. However, some of their paint jobs you can do are extremely complex. So I have to put them in every tier from lobotomite to super complex because there are so many ways to play them that it's really hard to gauge where they are. Next up are Tau. Tau are primarily ranged-focused warriors. They have a lot of mechs, a lot of guns. Basically, you're playing Gundam. You're playing Gundam with a steady gun line. So, with that being said, they're a pain to paint. They also have a lot of rules. You know where I'm going with this. They're going into counterintuitive. Because where they're so ranged-focused, you're not learning the game. Their rule basically says, hey, sit around for over half the game, you get a buff. It's not that hard. You sit on the objective, and then around round 2 or 3, you get those buffs, and then you don't lose the game. It's essentially this huge, giant waiting game, and you're going and going and going and going, but it's just not going to do it. But then you have the Tyranids. Tyranids have gotten a lot of love recently. Tyranids are hyper-adaptable, insectoid-esque creatures. And they got their codex recently, and there's many different flavors to choose from. You can take one that's more stealth-focused. You can take one that's more monster, big, heavy, Godzilla-esque feel to them. Overall, Tyranids kind of go into basic brain required. They don't have a hard painting scheme. They don't have a lot of issues. They're very, very good. And most of all, they don't suffer from the same issues as like the Adeptus Mechanicus or Space Marines. They're not boring. They're very organic. Their guns are organic. They're very fleshy. If you can't handle that, well, you got to find your bugs somewhere else. But they are very fun to play. And as someone who's played them myself, They have a unique style to them. You're playing bugs. You don't hate anyone. You don't hate anything. You're just extremely hateful towards everyone. And it's not even a sense of, okay, I'm hungry. It's more, well, it's in the sense of, I'm hungry. I don't hate you. I'm going to eat you. I don't care who you are. Do not plead for mercy. I do not understand your language. That's their level of, I'm hungry. Okay, so that's about 30-esque. 30, it's somewhere amongst the 30 range. All done. I don't know the current, I don't know, because we're the day I'm recording this, I don't know if these armies have changed around or if they got in their books yet. But what I do know is that it's finally the end of the episode. And it sounds a bit rushed, and I'm sorry, first episode, but thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you guys down the line. I really hope that everyone here comes back again if you listened. And before that, just a couple of credits. Credit to White Bat Audio for my intro, outro, and background music. Thank you to my occasional co-host, which I won't speak of yet because he has not arrived. However, with that being said, I hope you guys to see you again in the next episode where we talk about, well, with every army, you need a good leader. And that's what we're going to be going over. Maybe just one faction. Maybe all of them. I don't know. I will see you again next episode, and this is the end of Mini Doc episode 1.